Hello, everybody. So we're going to tie in semiotics, the study of the relationships of what you look at to make meaning, to current events. And the painting that we started with is 100 years old. So how are we going to tie this to current events? And what we're going to do is just talk about a horse. So you may see that there is a horse in the upper left-hand corner of this painting. But if you haven't figured out the semiotics of this painting yet, let's just look at what a horse might mean. Now, I believe I told you that in this abstract painting by Vasily Kandinsky, that an abstract painting is an idea or feeling. This idea is represented by an abstract horse, showing the feeling or idea of being out of control, an uprising of some kind of power. Stirs night, death, and the devil. We see two horses here, two men horses, and it becomes a static code, like a metonymic. When you put all the pieces together, you associate it with the 23rd Psalm. However, here, knight on the horse is Christian knight, and so it is power of his and convictions. The other figure on horse is death. The semiotic code is associated, and I'm sorry, in association with the hourglass time. Death's horse bows down to investigate the skull and tombstone that has Albrecht Dürer's initials on it. And the implication is that death will bow down because the Christian knight, with the strength of his beliefs, will go to the kingdom on the hill, which is seen at the top of the image. So here we begin to see some semiotics between the two horses, or two figures on a horse. We know that horse equals power. Now, the current events I want to talk about is the debate over the Confederate statues, some of which are in Richmond, that thrust Richmond into international news. And the debate about whether the statues should come down, whether they're appropriate, what is the right context for these statues. Well, the semester before George Floyd was killed, I asked my art appreciation students to write about the Confederate statues, especially the ones on Monument Avenue in Richmond. And that assignment was met with a big yawn. These were some old white dudes on horses that were in the background. And when you went to Richmond with your friends, you really didn't pay them any mind. They were just some big statues on pedestals that you drove around. And yet, after George Floyd was killed, just about a little more than a year ago, these same statues became ignition points. They were protest. They were defaced. People wanted them down. So even though the statues remain the same, people's reactions to them changed. So how did their meaning change? Because the year after George Floyd's death, I had impassioned papers about this subject. So these are some of the Confederate statues in Virginia, leading you to wonder, are there any Union statues in Virginia? And there's really not very many statues representing anybody in the Union. One, ironically, is in Petersburg, very near the college, very near Richard Bland College. And if you live locally, you'll see that there's a tire place and a CVS, and there's a grocery store, a Food Lion around the hill, sells pizzas nearby. Look at how short this statue is. It's not very tall. It's very unassuming. People drive by it. It's not very important. So that's the Union present in Virginia. And when we start looking at these statues, for example, Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville in 2017, it seemed like just part of the past. Well, not necessarily. We recently looked at metonymic codes where we compared sets of pictures. These are all photographs that are near the Robert E. Lee statue and were about the Robert E. Lee statue. So when you look at these pairs of pictures, we might have Unite the Right and Black Lives Matter, protesters and counter protesters. Now, when you look at these images, there are a lot of semiotic codes. I mean, the Confederate flag is a code for something, the American flag is a code for something, the riot gear is a code for something, the symbols against white supremacy mean something. These are images that are very much layered. So when we see the white nationalists with the tiki torches, there's layers of meaning to this, especially if you know that they marched around the Robert A. Lee statue shouting white nationalist slogans. Heather Heyer was the person, the woman who was killed. She was a counter protester, and one of the white nationalists drove their car into the crowd and killed her. So we have this almost violent reaction to a man on a horse that's a statue. Now, this is the statue that became most prominent after George Floyd died. And we're going to look at that progression. But first, I want you to look at just the statue itself. When I began this project and I wanted to refresh my scholarship by looking up more things, I always like to learn more before I give a talk. So I wanted to see if there was anything I'd missed. And I was really surprised at the hours I spent researching, trying to find any information only on the statue. By that, I mean, who made it? What does he represent? Um, does it mean anything if he faces the north or the south? Does it mean anything if the horse's head is bowed or up? What does it mean that it's on this type of pedestal? None of the articles that I found talked at all about the statue, but they really spoke about all of the meanings that people attached and what the statue said and expressed and how people reacted to it, but nothing about the statue itself. So that means that the semiotics of the denotations, the signifiers, change their significance. So let's take a look at this. Now, when we look at this series of pictures, that was Robert E. Lee for years. This next photo is kind of the first step that happened. Now, when you look at this, I want you to be aware that you're looking at a photograph, not the actual event, right? And there's something called hierarchical scale. A hierarchy is something that's more important. And so when you're looking at men on horses, hold on here, the hierarchical scale is making something psychologically important. So, for example, lifting up Robert E. Lee up into the heavens. Robert E. Lee is above the tree line, meaning that he is touching the heavens. He's taller than anything else. When you look at the other photographs of the Confederate generals, you might see a church in the background of one of them. When a community lifts something up, often the tallest building will show you, or the tallest object will show you what's important. For instance, the tallest buildings in Richmond are the financial buildings. So, of course, commerce and capitalism is important. Well, you can see here in the hierarchical scale that he's very important because he's psychologically lifted up. Also, if you've ever ridden a horse, you know how tall they are. Well, if he got off this horse, he would be taller than the horse's back, which means that psychologically he has more power than the horse. The fact that he's lifted up with granite makes it seem eternal. He's got a crest on the base that makes it seem as though he's a, Roman or Greek hero. It also looks like a crypt on the left-hand side where you see the granite columns and the bronze plaque. Well, even in death, he will live on in bronze, is what that means. Has conquered death. When we look at this image, the hierarchical scale is the I can't breathe poster. It's just a photograph, but the reason this speaks very loudly about a certain time in history is that the I can't breathe poster is as large as the base and statue almost. So that means that the power of, I can't breathe and black power is becoming as strong as this other symbol of white power. Now, um, I should say in context, when the statue was put up, when the statue of Robert E. Lee was erected, it was not during the Civil War. It was quite some time afterwards. And after the Civil War in Richmond, during the Reconstruction, the Black community really pulled it together and began thriving. You can think of people like Maggie Walker. They're, bustling businesses, economy was great. Black leaders were elected to important positions. There was a Black newspaper that kept people informed. So this rise of power in the Black community was very threatening to the whites. They leave the city. A real estate developer buys this huge tract of land west of the city and erects these monuments. Now, when the monuments were constructed, 80 years later, I think 50 years later, don't quote me on that, but much later, the speeches that were given during that time, you can look them up in the Richmond Times-Dispatch archives, were very much comfortable with asserting that this was a white neighborhood and this was a symbol of white power that showed the supremacy of the white man as he kind of looked upon this monument avenue. So it was intended that people would build very wealthy, large homes out. Is kind of, they were almost like country homes, but in the countryside, it was dominated by white power. No Blacks were allowed there. So at the time, though, the Black community responded very negatively. And there were a lot of newspaper articles in the Black newspapers where people protested. So it's not as though this was put up after the Civil War as a symbol of Lee's heroism. It was put up by a real estate developer who wanted to assert white power in a neighborhood that Blacks couldn't move into, and there was already Black opposition when it was put up. So the idea that this was kind of a neutral sculpture never happened, really. So we have this image. One of the other things that I find interesting as I look at this image and observe the details for evidence of what I am saying, I find it curious that there are so many white kids, and there's some people of color there. But I would say that this photograph kind of emphasizes the white allies that are there, a white fist holding up a Black fist, and not only referring to George Floyd, but other people who had been victims of police violence. So the graffiti defacing the statue is kind of this analogy to the anger of, people on the street at this kind of dominance of the white power. Now, this is a photograph that really was known around the world, very famous photograph. And I'd like for you to look at this photograph in particular for an assignment, for an assignment I'm going to give you on this. When you look at this photograph, there are so many layers of meaning, and there are so many ways for different people to interpret those meanings differently. And being as objective as you can, if you look at all of the images very closely and figure out how they all relate, you may be able to understand the different points of view and how they get them. but you also may understand what your point of view will be. So I'm going to help you with that, but this is the photograph that we're going to look at. So we'll come back to this in a moment, but I wanted to say that this tearing down of statues, this civil unrest, this destruction of art has happened in this country like since the founding fathers. So when people are horrified by what would the founding fathers think, here's a painting from 1859, and George Washington and his men, this is a little fictitious, but George Washington and his men are tearing down the statue of King George. They would famously tear down statues of King George in the Americas and melt them down and make bullets for British soldiers out of the statue metal. If you look in the background, you can see buildings very similar to the factories in Richmond, actually, at the time, where there's fire and smoke. People have torches. There's a big bonfire behind the Native Americans who are celebrating. You'll see blacks, whites, our founding fathers. Everybody is celebrating. And in the background, you can see that there's people sitting on a pedestal where they've already torn down a statue in protest. So this is showing the protest, and this is actually after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Pulling down the statue of King George disappeared, I think, like 9 days later. And you can see people are cheering. There's a big celebration. There's an uprising with people running around and with axes and pry bars trying to help destroy the statue. And yes, this was an actual animation from the time. Not really. It was just a funny thing I found on the internet for a little break. Well, one of the ways you can see a historical meaning in this, it's not all that uncommon for statues to be torn down, destroyed, be so significant, or such strong signatures of some idea. And so on these, this is something you could look up and read about it very shortly. There were a series of incredible, huge Buddhas carved into the mountains. There were, it was a larger than Mount Rushmore kind of thing, and it was a World Heritage sculpture site. And Buddha that's carved the side of the mountain. When the Afghan men came in the first time around, they considered these sacrilegious, and so they blew the heads off the Buddhas and destroyed these ancient, incredible carvings that were irreplaceable. Well, when the Taliban came in the second time to Afghanistan long ago, they set an election where they projected the heads of the Buddhas, the heads that have been blown off, are now projected onto the mountainside, and they charge tickets to come see the Buddhas they destroyed 20 years earlier. But now they want to sell you tickets so that they can use the money from the tickets to buy more ammunition and weapons. So there's a strange circular loop. This also goes back to the Christians. Christians weren't exempt from doing this. So this is a Roman marble statue. And, you know, the Roman statues often depicted different deities and gods, Aphrodite, for example. And on this one, a Christian has come in around 300 AD. That's like it's after the Edict of Milan, where the Christians were rising in power. And you'll notice that the head has been knocked off and the nose is gone. And that's something that's been symbolic throughout the history of tearing down statues, is to strip off the nose. So in effect, they can't breathe. They've, you know, this idea of I can't breathe was so interesting to me in the other photographs, because these statues where their nose is chopped off, it's kind of a traditional way to take someone out, but also destroy power. For example, in this Egyptian pharaoh here, 1000 BCE, one of the first things they do, knock the nose off so the pharaoh can't, I can't breathe in the afterlife. Um, they would also take off other body parts to render them impotent, if you know what I mean. So when we look at this idea of a horse and the meanings you can attach to a horse and a man, I want to come full circle then to this piece by Kehinde Wiley. Kehinde Wiley is a extremely world famous Black artist. He did President Obama's portrait. He does huge portraits that are hyper realistic and look like Renaissance paintings of Black subjects with these incredibly lush backgrounds. So usually paints amazing sculptor. He had a show at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, and he was taking a walk, taking a break from installing his this huge museum show. And he said he really couldn't believe all the Confederate monuments on Monument Avenue because as a Black man living in New York, it was just this, this condensed code that didn't seem like it belonged in the year 2020. So, or in the year 2019. And he said, as a Black man walking down Monument Avenue in his skin, he just felt like he was in another era and displaced. So he made this piece, this huge bronze sculpture in response. It was originally installed in Times Square, and the Virginia Museum bought it, and it now sits on the boulevard not far from where the Robert E. Lee statue used to stand, and also not far from other statues celebrating the Confederacy. I know the lawyer for the Virginia Museum of Fine Art, and there's a lot of logistics when they acquire a multi-million-dollar piece of famous art. And they said that they were afraid that they were going to lose funding because the patrons of the museum were traditionally these wealthy, older white ladies. And the lawyer said they'll be clutching their pearls. I don't know why they got this sculpture because they're going to lose so much money from their donors. And of course, the museum got incredible support for this, and the donors didn't clutch their pearls so tightly. So, what is it about this sculpture that also made people gasp and get upset? Well, first of all, it is a young Black man, and he's substituting a young Black man for the Confederate generals as being heroic. And he doesn't make him like a politician, doesn't make him like a leader. He's actually wearing a hoodie, he's got some dreads, and his jeans are torn, he's wearing sneakers. And so it's kind of this man on the street. I mean, he's not being depicted as a thug who's protesting. He's depicted as a heroic leader who's firmly in charge, moving forward, but also kind of looking towards the past. Now, even the body language could be seen in all kinds of different ways. And the body language is a form of semiotic code. The other little insert that Candy Wiley did here is on the huge pedestal. He writes rumors of war. Now, this horse definitely looks like they're about to charge. They're moving forward. Look at their ears, their tail, the active diagonals on their legs. And then when you look at the base of the sculpture, you can see it's going from a low position to a higher position. So it might be uphill, but this horse is going to, the power is going to overcome it. So when you have rumors of war, you might think of this as a tense title. I do know that at the time of the protests, that in Virginia locally, there were a lot of my students were from families that were three percenters, oath keepers, very conservative, and they were preparing for a civil war or a race war at this time. I mean, they were stockpiling canned goods, they were stockpiling ammunition. And so for him to do this sculpture that was rumors of war, was he trying to be provocative? Well, it turns out that the phrase is from the Bible, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. So that is a huge clue as to the meaning that Kehinde Wiley had with this piece. So you could compare Kehinde Wiley's interpretation of a man on a statue with the Robert E. Lee statue, and that could be interesting. Well, the Robert E. Lee is statue is put on Monument Avenue, so it's a monument. And I'd like for you to think as you start to write a paper, what is the difference between a monument or a memorial? And are there monuments to Blacks or are there memorials to Blacks? Now, sometimes you might think of street memorials. So as you start deconstructing these statues, and I don't mean taking them apart. What I mean is taking apart all the symbols and how people put them together to construct their meaning. Okay, so there's some links here to help you out. And if you follow through them, I think you'll follow my thinking on it to help guide you through this paper. I also have given you some other images that counter the Confederate statues. Some artists believe that their work is kind of an antidote to ill. So if you have something like you're protesting white power, well, you can be destructive or constructive. Kehinde Wiley believes that, you should construct something new to replace the old message. So he's actually creating a new message. Maya Lin, who we will talk about later, created the Vietnam Memorial and had her own sculptures that she made that send a message about the same topic. So be a historic interested in history. And if you were to consider in history and in history, did some for you, and you think, well, how could the meaning of this change in history or the same? You view those, it's going to help you. Now, for the second part here, I want to walk you through how you might look at the pages I just went over, and you might be able to kind of make notes. Let's see if it'll allow me. You might make notes that would help you with your paper. It was published. Let's see if it will look. Here we go. You have a page here where I added a little bit. I'm going to, I'll go to another page. I'm sorry, I thought it was published in modules. I'll publish it. What I would like for you to do when you close this video is go to the page that we reviewed with all the images on it and take note about what you found interesting. Okay. And as we go through our module, let me show you where everything is. I never have a great connection. I live out in the country, so I'm sorry about that. Here's some help. Don't you like seeing those words? All right, let's see if that's going to help you. Okay. At the top of this page, I've listed the different semiotic codes we're studying. I am sorry if the formatting got unusual on my screen. There's lousy formatting. I will change. But what I've done here is listed the different metonymic code associations or assumptions. So when you put your different photographs together, you put them together so people would make connections or associations. The analogical code is making an analogy. So you put two things together. Let's see, if you put butterfly wings on me, I'm a social butterfly. At the beginning of the semiotics, they put together a fork and a hand. So how is a hand and fork similar? you use it to serve or eat food. Uh, Displaced code is when you kind of sneak something in a little bit. It's often about taboos. And then a condensed code is when there's so much jammed in that there's layer after layer you can peel apart. So, what I'd like for you to consider is this. If horse equals power, and we're looking at pictures of horses with men on them, then when you put together the signifiers of a horse and man, those are just denotations. It's a horse and a man. What kind of power is that? Like, does the man have power over nature? Is it a powerful man? Is it a man who has things under control? So, what is the connotation? What type of power do you get when you associate horse and man? What if that man is Robert E. Lee? Then, when you say horse plus Robert E. Lee, what kind of power is that? And then when I put horse with BLM projected, that's a different kind of power, isn't it? And so if you say, well, horse plus Robert E. Lee, maybe originally it meant something to people, a certain type of power, but now that same power has different connotations. The power of BLM may have different connotations to different people. So, what happens when you make a mental comparison between Robert E. Lee and a statue? Now, what I mean by Robert E. Lee is not the statue. There's a statue that represents Robert E. Lee. So it's Robert E. Lee in bronze. So, what does the statue communicate about Robert E. Lee? If you put the man and the statue together, how does that change? It's not a man anymore. It's a large bronze heroic. You finish that idea. The other comparison you can make is I see that George Floyd has been put on a pedestal. And is there a comparison between George Floyd and the pedestal? Now, that might be a little bit confusing at first, but the pedestal supported Robert E. Lee. If George Floyd stands for Black Lives Matter or Black oppressed people, what happens when you put him on the base of the pedestal holding up Lee? The connotation there is Robert E. Lee built his power kind of on the backs of the labor of Blacks. Like the Blacks built Richmond. Blacks built, the mansions that the rich people on Monument Avenue were living in. So to put his face on the pedestal as though he's the support for this white power or has been the support for this white power could be an interesting direction to think about. Now, see the next one. There are several images that change the intention of the original meaning of the sculpture. You've noticed if you look at the codes, the semiotic codes at the top of the page, you'll see that these bold words help you figure out which code I'm directing you to. So two of the images that change the intention is the letters of BLM on Lee's horse. Lee's horse originally meant one thing, but when you put BLM letters on the horse, it means another thing, another kind of power. When I say the hierarchical scale of Floyd's face, if George Floyd's face was projected super small on the pedestal or normal size, but when you project a larger than life, this giant looming picture of Floyd on top of the pedestal, how does that change the feeling, change the meaning, change what the intention of the piece is? Now, this type of code often deals with a taboo subject. A taboo subject, something you don't normally talk about. And I found previously that while students very much wanted to express their feelings about these topics, um, they also said that it was a taboo subject. So if I tried to get a class discussion going, people clammed up because they were afraid of offending people. So what would be the images that might offend people that are kind of trying to change the intention of the original sculpture? Now, what are some of the layers of meaning you picked up on? I think with the guidance that you've had so far with the lecture on the pictures, and then kind of being walked through some of the previous semiotic codes, a condensed code is when there's lots of layers going on. And so, could you list the layers of meaning? Not that you have, but that you can see other people making. You might recognize blooms here as I'm trying to get you to think critically, not about Robert E. Lee and George Floyd and politics. I'm trying to get you to think critically about this man and this horse and all the meaning that people get from it, because it has been very meaningful. When you went through the ideas of horse's power, man plus horse, George Floyd plus horse, all of those associations, what's really curious maybe is that there is no man and there is no horse. It's just a hunk of metal on a chunk of stone. And it's hard to look at just a chunk of metal and say, oh, this is a man, this is a horse. This is a man that was heroic and now is an oppressor, and here is white power and here is black power. It's just a hunk of metal. So people are projecting all of these different views on the same statue. Can you analyze some of that and where it comes from? Can you evaluate the different views? And what do you think about all of this? You do not have to write a paper yet because we're going to let this simmer for a while. We'll talk about some other applications of semiotic codes that are easier. But as we talk about the easier applications, we're going to be coming back to this topic and the page on current events. At the end of this module, I'm going to ask you to write a paper where you decode the semiotics of the Robert E. Lee statue and George Floyd. We can talk about that more later, but first, I'm interested in you